Father Timothy Radcliffe, the distinguished Dominican friar and former master of the Order of Preachers, had never been particularly interested in motorsport. At 77 years of age, the Oxford-based theologian preferred the quiet contemplation of religious texts to the roaring engines of Formula One. Yet here he was, on a surprisingly mild autumn morning, waiting in a modest reception area at Silverstone Circuit. "Father Radcliffe, he'll see you now," announced a polite young woman with a headset. Timothy had come at the request of a mutual friend, a chaplain who occasionally provided spiritual guidance to various sporting organizations. Apparently, one of the drivers had expressed interest in discussing matters of faith with someone of Timothy's theological background. The name Hamilton had meant little to Timothy initially, until his nephew had nearly fainted upon hearing about the appointment. "You're meeting Lewis Hamilton?" "The Lewis Hamilton!" his nephew had exclaimed, wide-eyed with disbelief. The room Timothy was led into was surprisingly austere for someone of such apparent fame and fortune. No ostentatious displays of wealth or achievement, save for a single racing helmet placed carefully on a shelf. The man who rose to greet him had a quiet dignity about him, dressed simply in a black turtleneck and trousers. "Father Radcliffe, thank you so much for coming. I've read several of your books," Hamilton said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. Timothy was taken aback. "You've read my theological works?" Hamilton smiled. "Your perspectives on community and faith in what is the point of being a Christian particularly resonated with me during some difficult times." As they settled into conversation, Timothy realized this was no perfunctory celebrity meeting with a religious figure. The questions Hamilton posed were thoughtful, searching, born of genuine spiritual curiosity. They spoke of doubt and certainty, of finding meaning beyond success, of reconciling competitive drive with spiritual humility. "You know," Hamilton said, pouring tea for them both, "people see the cars, the championships, the lifestyle, but few understand the profound solitude of it all and how that solitude led me back to questions of faith." The meeting that Timothy had expected to last perhaps an hour extended well into the afternoon. As gray clouds gathered outside the window of Hamilton's private office at Silverstone, their conversation ventured into increasingly personal territory. "There was a moment, Father, after my 6th World Championship," Hamilton confided, his voice dropping slightly. "I stood on the podium, thousands cheering, champagne in hand, and felt absolutely nothing, a complete spiritual emptiness." Timothy nodded, recognizing the familiar contours of what mystics had called the dark night of the soul, success that fails to fulfill, achievement that leaves one hollow. "I've counseled many successful people experiencing similar feeling," Timothy said. "It's rather like climbing a mountain only to discover the view obscured by fog." Hamilton leaned forward. "Precisely. I'd defined myself by winning for so long that when winning no longer provided meaning, I began questioning everything." He described a period of intense questioning, nights spent reading philosophical and theological texts rather than reviewing race data, mornings meditating instead of training. His team had worried he was losing focus, but paradoxically, this spiritual seeking had brought a new dimension to his racing. "I began to see my career not as an end in itself, but as a platform, a voice given to me for purposes beyond trophies," Hamilton explained. Their conversation was interrupted by Hamilton's performance coach, who apologetically reminded him of scheduled commitments. As they prepared to part, Hamilton hesitated. "Father, would you be willing to continue this conversation? Perhaps somewhere less corporate?" Timothy, who had found himself unexpectedly moved by the driver's spiritual earnestness, readily agreed. "My door in Oxford is always open to you." "Actually," Hamilton replied with a slight smile, "I was thinking of somewhere that's special to me, a place where I first sensed something beyond the physical world." A week later, Timothy found himself walking alongside Hamilton on a windswept hilltop in Northamptonshire. No cameras, no entourage, just two men trudging along a muddy path as October winds whipped around them. "I used to come here as a boy," Hamilton explained, his breath visible in the cold air. "My father would be working multiple jobs to fund my karting, and sometimes the pressure felt overwhelming. This place became my sanctuary." The hilltop afforded a panoramic view of the English countryside. Patchwork fields, distant church spires, and the occasional glint of water. Not spectacular by conventional standards, but possessing a quiet, unassuming beauty. When I was 10, standing right here, Hamilton continued, pointing to a specific spot near a gnarled oak tree, I had what I can only describe as a moment of transcendence. I felt connected to something immeasurably larger than myself. I didn't have the vocabulary for it then. I simply told my father I'd felt happy dizzy, but looking back, I believe it was my first authentic spiritual experience. Timothy smiled at the description. Throughout his decades as a theologian, he'd heard countless accounts of spiritual awakening, from the dramatic to the subtle. What struck him about Hamilton's account was its unpretentious sincerity. Many people experience God first in nature, Timothy observed, long before they encounter him in scripture or liturgy. Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. For years, I tried to recapture that feeling through achievement. I thought if I just won enough, drove fast enough, broke enough records, I might feel that connection again. But it never came through winning. They stood in contemplative silence, watching a peregrine falcon circle overhead. Timothy was struck by the contrast. This quiet, reflective man seemed worlds apart from the competitive figure he glimpsed in the brief video clips his nephew had shown him. Father, Hamilton said finally, I've been wrestling with something St. Augustine wrote about finding God in the regions of unlikeness. That phrase has haunted me. I've achieved everything I dreamed of, yet often feel I'm living in a region of unlikeness, a place disconnected from my truest self. Timothy felt a surge of respect for this unexpected theological depth. Augustine was describing the prodigal son's journey, finding himself in a far country before returning home. Perhaps your journey has similar contours. Hamilton's eyes reflected both vulnerability and resolution. That's exactly what I wanted to explore with you. Their third meeting took place in the unlikely setting of Hamilton's London home, a space that surprised Timothy with its understated elegance, and notably a well-stocked library dominating one wall. No racing memorabilia was visible. Instead, art addressing themes of justice and equality adorned the walls. Hamilton had prepared tea, and as they settled into comfortable chairs, Timothy sensed a certain tension in the air, the unmistakable atmosphere of someone preparing to speak difficult truths. Father, there's something I need to confess, Hamilton began, his fingers tightening around his teacup. Not in the sacramental sense, as I know that's not your tradition nor mine, but something I've never articulated to another person. Timothy nodded encouragingly, setting aside his own cup. Throughout my career, I've been portrayed as someone driven by personal ambition, breaking records, accumulating championships. But the truth is far more complicated. Hamilton paused, gathering his thoughts. My true motivation, particularly in recent years, has been creating space for those who look like me in a sport that historically excluded them. He spoke of the profound isolation of being the only black driver in Formula One, of subtle and sometimes overt racism, of the burden of representation. More strikingly, he spoke of how his faith had become intertwined with his pursuit of justice within his sport. I began to understand my position as a spiritual responsibility, Hamilton explained. The platform I've been given isn't just about personal achievement. It's about witnessing to a greater truth, that God's image resides in every human being, regardless of race or background. Timothy was moved by the theological sophistication of Hamilton's understanding. Here was a man who had integrated his faith with his vocation in ways few accomplished. The world sees my activism as separate from my racing, Hamilton continued. They don't understand that for me, they become expressions of the same spiritual commitment. When I take a knee before a race or wear a shirt highlighting injustice, it's an act of prayer as much as protest. His voice broke slightly. What weighs on me, Father, is knowing that using my voice this way has cost me in popularity, in certain opportunities, in the simple comfort of being uncontroversial. There are days I question whether the sacrifice is worth it. Timothy leaned forward, deeply moved by this revelation. Lewis, what you're describing isn't just activism. It's vocation in the truest sense, a calling that costs something. It was during their fourth meeting in a quiet corner of an Oxford cafe that the conversation took its most profound turn. Hamilton arrived looking unusually tired, explaining he'd flown in directly from testing in Barcelona. "I've been thinking constantly about our conversations," Hamilton admitted, warming his hands around a mug of coffee. "Particularly about something you said regarding God being present in our most authentic self-expression." Timothy nodded, recalling their discussion of Augustine's concept of finding one's true freedom in divine service. "Well," Hamilton continued, "something extraordinary happened yesterday. During testing, there was a moment, just a few seconds really, when everything aligned perfectly. The car, the track, the conditions, and me." He described a phenomenon familiar to athletes but rarely articulated in spiritual terms, what psychologists call flow state, and what mystics might recognize as momentary transcendence. "I wasn't consciously controlling the car anymore. It felt as though something was working through me. The telemetry later showed it was the perfect lap. Literally not a millisecond could be improved upon." Hamilton's eyes grew moist as he continued. "In that moment, Father, I understood something I've been seeking to articulate for years. My racing, when approached with the right spirit, isn't separate from my faith or my pursuit of justice. They're all expressions of the same divine gift working through me." Timothy felt a lump forming in his throat as Hamilton spoke words that could have come from the greatest spiritual writers of the Christian tradition. "I realized that God doesn't just exist in churches or in quiet meditation. He exists in that perfect moment when I'm using the gifts I've been given to their fullest potential, whether that's driving a racing car, speaking out against injustice, or simply being fully present with another human being." Hamilton looked directly at Timothy, his expression one of profound revelation. "God is not just in the stillness, Father. He's in the speed, too. He's in every moment we're fully alive to our purpose." Timothy, a man not given to easy emotion after decades of theological discourse, found himself wiping away a tear. In his long career counseling seekers, he had rarely encountered such a profound insight expressed with such unaffected clarity. "Lewis," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "what you've articulated is what theologians have struggled to express for centuries, that the divine is encountered not by escaping our humanity, but by embracing it fully." Their final meeting took place, fittingly, in a small chapel on the outskirts of Oxford, a 12th century stone building that had witnessed centuries of prayers. Hamilton had asked to meet here, away from any possibility of recognition or interruption. As winter sunlight filtered through ancient stained glass, casting colored patterns across worn stone floors, the two men sat side by side in a pew, their conversation now comfortable, familiar. "I race again this weekend," Hamilton said quietly, "but something has fundamentally changed. For the first time in my career, I feel completely integrated. No separation between Lewis the racer, Lewis the advocate, and Lewis the spiritual seeker." Timothy smiled. "Integration is perhaps the highest spiritual achievement, when all aspects of one's life align with one's deepest values." Hamilton nodded. "I've decided to establish a foundation," he explained, outlining a vision for an organization that would combine his interests in education, diversity in motorsport, environmental sustainability, and spiritual well-being. Not something for publicity, in fact, I'm determined to keep my name out of it entirely, but something that expresses this integrated understanding I've come to. As they talked through the practical implications of this vision, Timothy was struck by the transformation he'd witnessed over these months. The man before him embodied a rare combination of contemplation and action, a spirituality expressed not through withdrawal from the world, but through full, principled engagement with it. "Before we part," Hamilton said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I wanted to share something with you." He handed Timothy a small worn card. On it, handwritten in a child's careful script, was a prayer. "God, help me go faster than I think I can. Help me be braver than I think I am. And help me remember that winning isn't just about being first." "I wrote this when I was 11, Hamilton explained quietly. "My teacher at the time had us write prayers. The other children wrote about toys or holidays. This was mine. I've carried it with me to every race since I was a teenager." Timothy read the words again, profoundly moved by their simplicity and depth. "This is true wisdom, Lewis, the kind that theologians spend lifetimes trying to express in complex language." As they prepared to part ways, Hamilton clasped Timothy's hand warmly. "Thank you, Father, for helping me understand that my whole life, the racing, the activism, all of it, can be a form of prayer when approached with the right intention." Timothy, overcome with emotion, could only nod as tears welled in his eyes. In his long service to the church, few encounters had affected him as deeply as these conversations with the racing driver who had sought not fame or absolution, but authentic spiritual understanding. Neither man knew that their conversations would remain private, never making headlines or social media moments. Yet in that obscurity lay their true significance, a genuine spiritual exchange between two seekers, far from the cameras and crowds. In the quiet sanctuary of that ancient chapel, something profound had been affirmed, that God is found not only in monasteries and meditation, but in the full, authentic expression of one's gifts in service to a purpose greater than oneself, even when that expression takes place at 200 miles per hour.